This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, and sometimes I like to look in the mirror and just reflect. My co-host is John Pasden, and he says he likes the color green more than yellow and blue combined. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner joining you here from the United States in Utah.
Hi everybody. I am actually not in Shanghai, China this week. I am in the mountains of Zhejiang province in a place called Tonglu. I'm with my family on vacation for the October holiday, but I'm still committed to recording.
It's amazing. John, you got to tell us about this place real quick. I've never heard of it.
It's just like a random little place in the mountains of Zhejiang. My wife found it somehow online, like on WeChat or something. And we actually found it years ago. And we've gone back over the years, like this is before COVID that we started going. And like we've seen the lady's kids grow up and she's super nice. And my wife has introduced other people to this place and we go back. And one of the reasons that I really love it is because we were here like from October 1st, the beginning of the holiday, and there weren't that many people here. Because right now in China on the October holiday, the whole idea is everyone travels and, you know, gets around and enjoys the time off.
It's insane.
Yeah, it can be super insane. Like I would love to go to Beijing now because the weather is so great, but Beijing is just absolutely chaotic right now.
Wow.
But for whatever reason, this place doesn't have that many people and it's super nice here up in the mountains.
Cool. So is it just kind of like, scenic and hiking or just what's it like?
Like the first 2 days, it was actually warm enough to do some swimming, both in the pool and in like mountain stream, like next to a waterfall type stuff. But then it suddenly got cold today, so no more swimming.
Ah, wow. Good time. Well, you can still swim in cold water.
Oh yeah, some people do like ice baths and crazy stuff like that. No, not us. We're okay with a little bit of cold swimming, but not insanely icy, no.
I've been doing some ice baths recently. It's refreshing.
Yeah, right. That's cool. You do you, man.
We'll talk about that some other time. But today, we are going to be talking about a concept called narrow reading. Now, I got to give a shout out to John Kerr, who sent us this article. It's not exactly a paper, it's an article. It was written, John, it's like 20 years ago this was written. And there's been just kind of various talk about it before. I hadn't actually heard of this concept before he sent me this paper, but it's very intuitive.
And it connects to Stephen Krashen, second language acquisition. A lot of the theory goes back to Stephen Krashen, comprehensible input. And he is also one of the people behind, the research on this topic.
Well, he actually wrote this article.
Yep. But this is also one of those things where like you don't really need a ton of research to get it and to understand why it's useful.
Definitely. It's rather intuitive. So let's go ahead and get into this. Okay, so the concept of narrow reading, first off, it starts out with this premise that oftentimes in a language class or a language course, we get kind of varied exposure to the language in the form of like different topics. So we all want to be able to be well-versed so we can converse in most things in Chinese or whatever other languages that you might be learning as well. And then later on, as you get into more advanced courses, then you get a little bit more specialized, maybe go into some of the focus areas. And what he's suggesting here is that, hey, maybe there's a little bit wrong. And so he's thinking, hey, maybe you should think about, or we can consider specializing earlier in the language. And so the idea here is like, all right, maybe you could go into a single topic of interest to you, or that you're going to be doing this with your language. So instead of maybe just trying to go real broad in your studies, you get really kind of focused from the very get-go in your language learning. And so he calls that narrow reading. So it's based on the idea that acquisition of the language in both structure and vocabulary can come from very focused study in a specific topic.
Yeah, and so my exposure to this concept was actually, it's kind of from two sources. Like the first source was from textbooks. So a lot of people, when they're learning Chinese, they just follow the textbook. And in the beginning, everybody starts with ni hao and your family and your hobbies and ordering food and all that. But once you go far enough and you get to intermediate or even higher, the amount of material that you need to start being able to understand and discuss just really starts multiplying. And so to be able to talk about, all the topics at an intermediate or upper intermediate level, it just gets to be more and more. And because at All Set Learning, we're focused on personalizing, we started questioning, I think, sooner than a lot of people, like, do you really need to learn about this if you're never going to use it and you actually hate that topic? So, you can understand if you're looking at a textbook and it's got like 10 chapters and one of them is maybe economics and you never want to talk about that. And another one is, maybe talking about social problems and you really want to talk about that. You can see how narrowing in on certain topics and being able to focus on those in your studies is going to help you.
Yeah. Something that comes to mind on this is, we're talking about textbook, but, I think of a case when someone might be going to China just for fun. And oftentimes you'll get like a phrase book. And those phrase books will have phrases in there that are likely to have some sort of words that you aren't going to be learning, maybe in a traditional class at a low level. But for that specific function, that's not entirely relevant. You just need to be able to do what you're going to do. And so you have these phrases and things that you're going to try to learn. And so you can be able to communicate what it is you want or trying to do in Chinese. And to me, I'm thinking, that's a little bit of this concept of narrow reading.
So that's like super early narrowing down because you're not going to have like this really long stay and you just want to focus on exactly what you need, like as early as possible, right?
Exactly.
But for a lot of people, it comes at a point where, they've already gotten to, like an intermediate level, and to keep improving across the board, like think of it as an upside down triangle or an inverted pyramid. Like as your level goes up, the amount of vocabulary you need to acquire to go to the next level, it just keeps getting larger and larger. And there comes a point when you're like, do I really need to go all the way across the spectrum of vocabulary when really I want to focus on this stuff? So like another way that this was really highlighted for me personally was working with people who were studying the HSK. And it usually started happening around HSK 5, definitely HSK 6. And because that's an academic test, it's designed to go like across the entire spectrum of language. And so if you really want to take the test and you need that test score, then okay, you got to take the test. But for a lot of people, they knew what they wanted to do with the language. And so like, why do you have to go across the entire spectrum if you know what you want to specialize in already?
John, as you are talking about this, something that comes to mind. I love that analogy of language learning being like that inverted upside down pyramid, like a funnel almost. And so, it takes a little bit of sand, fill that up at the beginning, but getting to the top, it's a lot more. And this concept of maybe narrow reading, and I almost want to modify that a little bit. Maybe it's like narrow learning. It's more of like, I guess, decreasing the angle of that pyramid, right? So instead of a very, a wide inverted pyramid, the angle of that pyramid is just a lot sharper. It's more pointy, if you will. So filling it up to get higher would take less and less, not as much sand as if it was a very wide pyramid.
Well, actually, the analogy I like to make, since we're talking about filling the pyramid, like instead of filling it with water, where it has to go all the way across in order to go up, like that's what you're doing when you're doing a standardized system, right? Then you think of it as sand or even clumpy sand, where you can actually make like a pile, like, in the middle. It's going to kind of fall down the side a little bit, and you're going to have to get like a somewhat broader base in order to specialize, but you don't have to go all the way across, right?
Yeah, I guess it's like building a sandcastle on the beach a little bit.
In a funnel, yes.
Fill up your bucket, turn it upside down. There we go. We've got a little tower of knowledge right here.
Unfortunately, it's a little harder than that, but, similar ideas.
Yes. The analogy breaks down if you pick it apart too much, but I think you all get the idea.
Okay, so I mentioned that like if you're focused on textbooks or if you're focused on the HSK, you might kind of by default going a little too broad than you really need. And so narrow reading or narrow learning might really be a breath of fresh air because you can focus on what you need and want to learn. But another thing I think that is worth talking about is the news, because there are quite a few learners that they feel like the news is something they want to be able to read. And they might even see the news as a form of narrow reading because, it's not literature. It's not talking about history with old ladies. It's the news, right? It's narrower.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But actually, the news itself is kind of broad, and you can go narrower within the news.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you think about this, if you do look at the news, there's obviously different subject matters. It could be health and fitness, science, politics, business, whatever it is. And I imagine, well, not imagine, I think about it, John, when I had first decided to really get more interested in news here in the US, I started reading the Wall Street Journal. And I was going to business school, and I decided I need to start reading the finance section and the business section. And, funny enough, I came across different aspects of vocabulary and different terms that I just was not as familiar with. And I had to sit down and read and look up some of these words, like, what exactly does this mean? And I was like, oh, there we go. Okay. So I did some of my own narrow reading as I was getting ready to go to grad school.
Yeah, and I did my own narrow reading too when I was getting ready for applied linguistics in Chinese. And it turned out to be a lot easier than I thought because I was just reading linguistic stuff and not trying to read everything. I wasn't reading all the news. I was focused on linguistics papers. But, I've known people who were focused on the news and, if they're just reading finance, then they're going to see those same terms a lot more often than if they're trying to get the broad spectrum of the news every time they read the news, right?
Yeah, definitely. John, there's this unique application, though, of this narrow reading concept that I'm remembering. There's this guy I had interviewed on episode 110. It's how your personality changes in another language. And I interviewed Taha Shlibek. Now, Taha's from Algeria, and he decided he wanted to learn Chinese, and he had listened to this podcast. And so he did something that I had always was interested in seeing if someone could do this. What he did is he got our books, and he went on our website and he got the word list to the Mandarin Companion, different graded readers that he had bought. And he went and he just studied the word list, okay, for our books. And he learned all those characters and their meanings and the words. And then he just jumped directly into trying to read the books. And he said, it was a little bit slow going, but I should go back and re-listen to his interview a little bit. But I think it took him like 6 months before he was able to actually read some of those breakthrough level graded readers. And
But wait a minute, this was breakthrough?
Yeah.
All right, I got to say, that's not exactly the same thing here because with narrow reading, it's talking about specializing earlier. This is more similar to what you were saying before about choosing the phrases you want to learn from a phrase book, right?
That is a good point. But the point I think behind what Taha did is that he did get very narrowed in the respect that he only learned exactly what he needed to learn in order to read the book. One of our Mandarin Companion books, which I thought was very interesting. So you could say maybe it's not narrow reading, but he didn't go through and learn all those other things or maybe other words and things he might randomly encounter going through some sort of textbook or language learning course. He only focused on what he needed to know to learn to read that book.
Okay, so the difference here would be that the things that he was not learning might actually have been quite useful and quite low level, but they just weren't in our books. Whereas with narrow reading, you're usually choosing not to read in a certain topic, whether it's, biology or whether it's, Chinese history, because you want to kind of really focus on another genre in your Chinese learning.
Well, I think it could be used both ways. And if we take that concept of not just narrow reading, but narrow learning, you can say, all right, I'm really interested in this aspect. I may be in food or culture or whatever it is, or movies. And so I am going to, in fact, maybe, hey, there's this movie or this, anime series you want to watch, and somehow you get a transcript of that show or something. And there's all sorts of tools out there. You could just take a transcript and break it down into just the characters and stuff. I'm going to focus on learning these characters and then these words so that I can go and watch this show, or I can be able to read this book or something like that.
Right. It's just that most people don't want to really limit a strong foundation, right? But, it's all a matter of sequence, right? So maybe you do that first and then you pick up the other stuff later, as long as you're not totally neglecting essential vocabulary, then it'll all work, right?
Yeah. But, I think, as we're talking about this, I'm not saying, everything I'm throwing, hey, this is how you have to do it or this is the best way. But I think it's interesting because one of the things that Krashen does bring up here is that if you're doing some narrow reading, you're typically focusing on some sort of topic that is interesting to you. And John, as you and I know, in all of our years of experience in this is that if you're very interested in what you're learning, and if your learning activities are energizing and stimulating to you, then you're going to have a much better experience, and the efforts you're putting in are going to be a lot more effective in helping you learn than if you are not interested in what you're learning. And I think that that's an X factor in there, which I think is really important in discussing this topic.
Yeah, so let's put this in terms that might be useful for some of our listeners out there. Like, at what point might narrow reading become relevant to your own studies? And, like Jared just said, it has to relate to your interests. And if you look at the research also, it's usually around intermediate or a little above that, where you'll get to a point in your studies where maybe you're happy that you've got a certain foundation and you can now communicate and you can read a lot of stuff, but you're starting to get frustrated that a lot of what you're reading isn't what you really want to be reading about. And that's where narrow reading is going to help you, kind of revitalize your motivation. But also, because you're focused, the vocabulary is going to start to stick more because you're going to be seeing the same words and phrases again and again.
Or you're going to be using it again and again. One more thing I'll throw out there, John, is that I've mentioned this a number of times. My wife and I, we started a bakery there in Shanghai. We were China's first, best, and only cinnamon roll bakery. And in the process of that, I learned a lot of, words that most people wouldn't learn, like how to say yeast and proofing chamber and convection oven and all these words that would be very unique to baking. And I think at that point, my Chinese, I had a really solid base, so it was easier to pick that stuff up. But my wife had to learn a bunch of those, and her Chinese wasn't as good as mine at the time. And so, it's like, hey, I really did have to focus on a narrow aspect to be able to function and do what we were doing.
All right. So those are all good points. You might have special needs for using Chinese. Maybe you're not in an environment where you can use it, and reading really is the focus. But just keep in mind that if you're starting to feel a little bit bored by what you're reading, it might be that specialization in the form of narrow reading or narrow learning can be what you need.
And at the end of the day, if it's something that's energizing and of interest to you, then man, go for it.
You can learn Chinese.
I hope so. No, you definitely can. You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. My name is Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, and Sinosplice.com. If you love listening to this podcast, subscribe, take a moment, and text it or message or share this episode with a friend or anywhere on social media. This helps us to reach more people on their language learning journey. You can leave us a review on iTunes or reach out to us at mandarincompanion.com or find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can find our Chinese Graded Reader Series on Amazon, iBooks, Google Play, or wherever you get your books. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Jasper Chua. And of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.